Okay, welcome to part 5 of the series defending the historical reliability of the gospel accounts. Here I will summarize parts 1 through 4 and discuss their implications. If you have skipped to this part, I would recommend going back and watching the series in order. Here is our timeline, which contains 7 steps by which to establish the New Testament's historical reliability. Firstly, we know that Jesus existed as a historical figure. This is corroborated by secular sources, the existence of the Christian Church, the number of New Testament manuscripts, and by the vast majority of scholars. Secondly, we know that the things he did were accurately recorded in the original gospel accounts. There was much evidence given for this, but the most significant piece was that the final gospel accounts do not contradict. If, as the skeptic implies, one of the authors had a lapse in memory, then one would expect his account to differ from the others, but this is not what we see, as seen by the combined account of Jesus' death. Thirdly, we know that the 4 gospel accounts were written independently of each other, and that Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not fall prey to the synoptic problem. Fourthly, the gospel accounts are not concerningly biased. This is the case for subconscious bias because the gospel writers do not bear the marks of one that is biased to the point of being unable to accurately convey the facts. Furthermore, what bias they did have, I think, would have encouraged them to record the gospel events with more accuracy, not less. And I do not think that they were fraudulent due to a lack of any plausible motive and because their writings do not appear fraudulent. At this point, by ruling out potential sources of error like a lack of independence or fraud, we established that the events of Jesus' ministry were accurately recorded in the original gospel accounts. The 5th step was to show that the original gospel accounts were accurately transmitted to the first extant manuscripts. This is a 100-year gap at the most, and I showed that we have good reasons to believe that nothing significant was changed in it. This was done by citing the number of extant New Testament manuscripts, the time gap between the earliest extant manuscript and the events that it records, and the interdependent nature of the gospel accounts as seen in step 2. I then used the Great Apostasy as a case study by which to further illustrate the truth of step 5. Step 6 established that the information in the first extant manuscripts was accurately transmitted in the 13 or so centuries until the time that the printing press was invented. This I defended by citing the consistency between New Testament manuscripts, which is remarkably high, being over 99%. And most of the 1% that is different are very minor differences. This is in spite of their quantity, their number of languages, and the time span that they cover. They were very good at the game of telephone. The 7th and last step was to establish that the final accounts as of 1440 AD do not contradict in any major way. To defend this, I largely referred to others who have written volumes on this subject, as I did not want to reinvent the wheel. But I did give some general rules to go by, making the important distinction that a small difference does not compromise the integrity of the entire account. So, when we step back and look at all 7 steps, we can see an accurate line of transmission from the time of Jesus' ministry all the way until the invention of the printing press in 1440 AD, at which point the criticism largely stops because no one doubts the accuracy of a printing press. If we judge the gospel accounts with the same standard that we judge other documents with, then we would believe beyond a reasonable doubt that the historical events in them are true. They pass every historical test in a way that no other ancient document even comes close to. We know that the events in them actually happened. Note that many of the arguments I used in this video also apply to the rest of the New Testament. Furthermore, I defend the apostolic writings, which include the books of the New Testament that are not the Gospels or Acts, in a video that is later in this series. Before I give the implications of this, let me give an alternative way to show the Gospel account's truthfulness. This takes the form of 8 tests compiled by the former skeptic and lawyer Lee Strobel. In the left-hand column, I have the number of the test. Moving to the right, I have the name of the test. Then I give its content in the 3rd column. In the 4th column, I give evidence from the gospel accounts that shows that they passed the test. Test number 1 is the intention test. It asks, did the authors intend for their accounts to be treated as historical fact? In the case of the Gospels, the answer is a resounding yes. The genre matches, including historical details about places and people in power. Generally speaking, the facts do not appear to be embellished, and the authors likely risked their lives to write what they wrote. Test number 2 is the ability test, and asks the question, did the authors have the ability to accurately record their story? In the case of the Gospels, all 4 authors were either eyewitnesses to the events that they recorded or had access to the eyewitnesses, and they were not dumb. They were quite capable of accurately recording the events they saw with their own eyes. The third test is the character test and asks, were the authors lying? I addressed this in detail in step 5 of the timeline, or actually it was step 4. Nobody dies or is even persecuted for a claim they know is false. The fourth test is called the consistency test and asks, do the different accounts agree? I would say yes, given the vast amount of work that has been done on this topic, including my reconciliation of the 4 accounts of Jesus' death earlier in this video. Test number 5 is the bias test and asks, were the authors either intentionally or unintentionally biased? Again, this was addressed in step 4 of our timeline. And test number 6 is called the cover-up test and asks, did they omit inconvenient truths? We touched on this in step 5. Or actually, it was in step 4. The authors would have had no reason to include the examples of the lackluster performance of the disciples throughout the ministry of Jesus, unless, of course, it was true. Test number 7 is called the corroboration test and asks, do external sources corroborate their claims? Yes. In step 1, we explained how the major events of Jesus' ministry are corroborated by secular sources. Test number 8 is the most difficult test to pass and is called the adverse witness test. It asks, what did the critics say? Because if anyone is going to deny it, it would be the critics, right? Well, generally speaking, the ancient critics of the gospel accounts did not deny the major events that they recorded. They only reinterpreted them. For example, no one denied that Jesus performed what appeared to be miracles. All the critics did was attribute them to trickery or sorcery. But given what we know about Jesus from the gospel accounts, was he likely to be a con man or under the influence of some satanic power? No. Or none of the critics of early Christianity denied that the tomb of Jesus Christ was empty or that his apostles went around proclaiming afterwards that he had resurrected. Of course, they reinterpreted these facts to say that the apostles stole Jesus' body and were lying about it. But given their willingness to die for that claim, do we really think they were lying? I explain in more detail the historical evidence for the resurrection in my video on the topic. So generally, the critics did not deny the events of the gospel accounts. They only reinterpreted them, interpretations that we can decide for ourselves are reasonable or not. So in summary, the Gospels pass all 8 of the tests, which I think is moderate to strong historical evidence for their truthfulness. Now, what are the implications of this? If the Gospel accounts are historically accurate documents, then what they say about historical events is true. This means that Jesus existed, he performed miracles, he was falsely crucified, he rose from the dead, and he did all these while claiming to be God. He also ascended to the Father, and it is implied that he remains there today, interceding for us if we have faith in him. Remember that these are real, historical, actual events that the Gospel accounts record, and many skeptics will refuse to study the Gospels as historical documents because of the spiritual implications of those historical events. But can you imagine if we treated any other event of ancient history this way? Imagine reading about Julius Caesar's invasion of Gaul and saying, I'm really anti-Rome, and his invasion of Gaul disturbs me, so I will refuse to study this event from a historical perspective. That would be silly, and yet that is how the Gospels are treated. They are largely rejected, not for their historical value, but for the spiritual implications that are embedded in those historical events. I know it is controversial to say that, but we know that if any secular text was supported by the amount of evidence that the Gospel accounts are supported by, they would be accepted as historical fact, and any criticism of it would be deemed ludicrous, not the other way around. Instead, we have secular texts that are supported by far less evidence than the Gospel accounts are supported by, and those are taught as fact and the Gospel accounts as fiction. An example is Julius Caesar's invasion of Gaul. But it's not just that. No other ancient document comes even close to matching the evidence that supports the gospel accounts. The Gospels, historically speaking, are more true than the entirety of what is in our textbooks of ancient history. In spite of this, the Gospel accounts are thrown out. This cannot be on the basis of evidence. For the moment we look at the evidence, we are obligated to believe them. They are rejected, I think, for several reasons. Firstly, most who reject them are simply brought up that way. That is especially the case in academia, where a strong anti-supernatural sentiment has dominated for generations. Many of those who reject the Gospels are simply doing what they were taught. But I also think that many of those who reject the Gospels are themselves biased against the supernatural, and because they don't like what the Gospels have to say. Much of the unpopular theology listed in Step 5 is still unpopular today, and people continue to reject the Gospels because of that, not because of the evidence. And they do this all while claiming to be creatures of reason and science. It is completely irrational, yet it shouldn't come as a surprise because this is precisely what the Bible says will happen. With that being said, if you are a Christian and you meet someone who rejects the Gospels for these reasons, be sure to have compassion on them, knowing that when we weren't any better, God still loved us by dying on a cross in our place. That marks the end of this video. Hopefully you have a better idea of how the gospel accounts are historically reliable documents. Thank you for watching. In the next video, I will defend the historical reliability of the Old Testament. I hope to see you there.